Throughout history, humanity has never stopped fighting, not only to defend its lands but to prove its intelligence, courage, and will to survive. Every battle carries untold stories, bold strategies, fatal mistakes, and moments that change the course of the world. Here on Military Tactics channel, we revisit those pages of history to understand why sometimes a single decision can create a legend. Let's begin today's story. February 11th, 1945. Under the cover of darkness, approximately 20,000 German and Hungarian soldiers charged through the ruins of Budapest in a desperate breakout attempt. Soviet machine guns, artillery, and tanks tore them apart in carefully prepared kill zones. By dawn, only 700, just 3.5%, had reached safety. This was not just a military disaster, it was the final act of Hitler's last great gamble. A 50-day siege that consumed his remaining elite Panzer reserves and opened the road to Berlin. By the autumn of 1944, the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front was in terminal collapse. The Red Army had just completed Operation Bagration from June through August, the most devastating defeat in German military history. Army Group Center was destroyed, 28 divisions gone. The Soviets were now surging through the Balkans. Germany's last significant ally, Hungary, stood directly in their path. And with Hungary came something Hitler could not afford to lose: the Nagy Kaniza oil fields. This was not just about ideology. Without Hungarian oil, the Panzers would run dry. Nagy Kaniza represented one of the Reich's last remaining natural sources of petroleum. The city itself controlled the Danube crossings and the rail lines running straight to Vienna, the gateway to the Reich's heartland. Budapest's position made it both a strategic choke point and a symbolic prize. If the Soviets took it, the road to Germany would lie wide open. But Hungary's regent, Miklos Horthy, was wavering. Secret peace feelers to the Soviets threatened to pull Hungary out of the war entirely. Hitler's response was characteristically ruthless. On October 15, 1944, he launched Operation Panzerfaust. Otto Skorzeny, the commando who had snatched Mussolini from his mountain fortress, led a lightning coup in Budapest. Skorzeny's men stormed the Buda castle, the Bergburg. They kidnapped Horthy's son and forced the regent's abdication at gunpoint. Within hours, Ferenc Szalasi's Aerocross party seized power. Fanatical fascists who would fight to the bitter end. Hitler immediately declared Budapest a Festung, a fortress to be defended at all costs. The order was explicit: no retreat, no surrender. Throughout November and December, the Red Army tightened its grip. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky commanded the 2nd Ukrainian Front from the north, while Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin led the 3rd Ukrainian Front from the south. They converged on the city, methodically crushing Hungarian defensive lines and driving relentlessly toward the capital. On Christmas Eve, 1944, the Soviet pincers closed. Tens of thousands of Axis troops found themselves trapped inside Budapest. German Wehrmacht units, Waffen-SS cavalry divisions now fighting as infantry, Hungarian regulars, and Aerocross militia, all under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Karl Pfeffer Wildenbruch. With them were more than 800,000 civilians trapped inside the city. The trap was set, but as the Soviet pincers closed, the question was no longer whether the city could be held, it was what Hitler was willing to sacrifice trying to save it. The Soviets struck Pest first, the flat, eastern side of the city, divided from Buda by the Danube. Its wide avenues were perfect for tanks. The Red Army had perfected the art of urban assault. They deployed storm groups, combined arms, teams of infantry, engineers, and 85 tanks. The tactic was methodical: blast through a building's ground floor, clear each level room by room, while engineers demolished internal walls to create new paths of attack. Tanks provided direct fire support from the streets. What followed was a 50-day descent into medieval brutality fought with modern weapons. The battle became three-dimensional. Defenders fired Panzerfausts from windows, fought in cellars, and turned Budapest's vast sewer network, more than 65 kilometers of tunnels, into an underground battlefield. Soldiers and civilians alike attempted to escape through the darkness beneath the city streets. The Soviets countered with a tactic that still haunts survivor testimonies. They flooded sections of the sewers with gasoline and ignited them. Men attempting to escape through the tunnels found themselves trapped in an inferno. Their screams echoed through the network. Those who did not burn drowned when other sections were deliberately flooded with icy water. Budapest's underground had become a three-dimensional nightmare: fire above, fire below, and no way out. By late January, the garrison was dying by degrees. Soldiers were receiving less than 800 calories a day, starvation rations that left them too weak to fight effectively. Ammunition stocks were measured in hours, not days. Tanks sat abandoned across the city, useless hulks drained of fuel. Air resupply had become the only lifeline, but Soviet anti-aircraft fire and the brutal winter weather reduced sorties to a mere trickle. One German officer's diary, later compiled by historian Christian Ungvar, described the conditions. "We eat horse meat when we can find it. The wounded lay in cellars without morphine, screaming for days. Yesterday, 3 men shot themselves rather than continue. The city was consuming itself, and amid this tactical nightmare, the Arrow Cross unleashed their own horror." In January of 1945, fascist militiamen marched thousands of Jews from the ghetto to the banks of the Danube. There, they executed them in mass shootings. The bodies tumbled into the frozen river. Survivors would later testify that the Danube ran red with blood. It was genocide, carried out in full view of a city under siege. Against this backdrop of atrocity, 2 men stood as witnesses to what remained of humanity. Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, and Giorgio Perlasca, an Italian businessman posing as a Spanish envoy, issued thousands of forged passports. They set up safe houses and confronted Arrow Cross gunmen directly. Wallenberg's words to the executioners became legend. "You will be held personally responsible for every life lost in this house." Tens of thousands of Jews survived because these 2 men refused to look away. By mid-January, Pest was lost. The defenders demolished the historic Danube bridges, including the iconic Chain Bridge, and retreated into Buda's fortified hills, buying time they did not have. The eastern half of the city lay in ruins. Smoke rose from 1,000 fires. The bridges, Budapest's pride, were now twisted metal skeletons jutting from the frozen river. Their only hope lay with the relief force Hitler had promised an army already dying in the frozen Hungarian countryside. On New Year's Day, 1945, the most powerful armored force Germany could still muster began its attack. The 4th SS Panzer Corps elite divisions, equipped with King Tigers and Panthers, the most formidable tanks in the world, smashed through the initial Soviet lines. For a brief moment, it seemed the relief of Budapest might succeed. But Hitler had made a catastrophic miscalculation. To assemble this force under SS Obergruppenführer Herbert Otto Gille, he had pulled the 3rd SS Totenkopf and 5th SS Viking divisions from the Vistula front. The critical defensive line, 300 meters to the north, shielded the approaches to Poland and to Germany itself. The panzers that should have been defending the road to Berlin were instead being thrown into the frozen Hungarian mud. Generaloberst Otto Wöhler, commanding the German forces in Hungary, had argued for a tactical withdrawal from Budapest to let the garrison break out early before the trap closed completely. Preserve the troops, shorten the lines. But Hitler overruled him. His Führer directives were explicit. Budapest would be held, and the relief would succeed. 3 times they tried. Operation Conrad I was launched on January 1st. The SS Panzers drove forward, their 88mm guns tearing through 34s. They gained ground. Then the Soviets counterattacked with fresh reserves. The advance stalled. Operation Conrad II began on January 7th again, initial success, and again, Soviet depth absorbed the blow. The Germans took casualties they could not replace. Veteran tank crews were killed. Irreplaceable officers were lost. Operation Conrad III, launched on January 18th, was the final attempt. During that last push, the SS spearheads actually reached within 20 kilometers of Budapest, close enough that the trapped garrison could see the gun flashes on the horizon. Some soldiers later recalled believing that rescue was finally at hand. Pfeffer's radio operators even picked up German transmissions. The panzers were coming. But it was an illusion. The King Tiger's 68-ton monsters with 185mm of frontal armor and the legendary 88mm gun were tactically superior to anything the Soviets fielded. Only 492 had been produced during the entire war. Each one was an engineering marvel. On paper, they were unstoppable. But in reality, they were also mechanically unreliable. They consumed fuel at catastrophic rates. Their sheer weight, 68 tons, made them dangerously vulnerable in the muddy, icy Hungarian terrain. Crews watched helplessly as these technological marvels bogged down, broke through frozen roads, or simply ran out of fuel kilometers from their objectives. The 34-85s were outmatched individually, 32 tons. An 85mm gun, less armor. But the Soviets had built more than 22,000 of them by the war's end. They were reliable, easy to maintain, and there were always more. The Soviets had not won through superior equipment, they had won through depth. Layer after layer of anti-tank guns and massed artillery that could obliterate entire grid squares. Operational reserves stood ready to plug any breakthrough. The German relief force bled out through attrition between 20,000 and 30,000 casualties. Hundreds of irreplaceable tanks were destroyed. Veteran crews were killed, men who could never be replaced. And then came the consequence Hitler had not foreseen. On January 12, 1945, while Gilles' panzers were dying in Hungary, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive against the now fatally weakened German lines to the north. The advance was devastating. The divisions that should have been defending the Vistula front were gone, bleeding out in the Hungarian mud instead. Soviet forces punched through the undermanned German positions and raced west. The road to Berlin lay open. The gamble had failed completely. The SS panzers, bled white just 20 kilometers from Budapest, began their retreat. They left behind burning tanks, frozen corpses, and the shattered hope of the garrison they had come to save. And hundreds of kilometers to the north, the consequences of Hitler's obsession were about to become catastrophically clear. The order came on the night of February 11th. Pfeffer Wildenbruch, the garrison commander, had waited as long as he dared. His men were starving, out of ammunition, and compressed into a pocket barely a few city blocks wide on Castle Hill. Hitler's order was clear: no surrender, no breakout fight to the last man. But Pfeffer Wildenbruch had seen enough men die for nothing. Records and post-war testimonies show that commanders inside Budapest, including Pfeffer Wildenbruch himself, had made repeated appeals for permission to attempt an earlier breakout. All had been denied by higher command. Now, with his soldiers receiving less than 800 calories per day and ammunition stocks measured in hours, he made the decision Hitler had forbidden. At midnight, approximately 20,000 soldiers, along with a handful of civilians, charged west in 3 waves under cover of darkness and fog, hoping to reach the German lines 30 kilometers away. They moved through the ruins in near silence, a desperate column of ghosts slipping through the skeletal remains of Buda. But the Soviets were ready. Marshal Malinovsky had fully anticipated the attempt. He had prepared his kill zones with methodical precision, machine gun positions sighted on every likely route of escape. Artillery had been pre-registered on the open ground, and tank companies were positioned to cut off any escape. As the first wave cleared the edge of the city, Soviet artillery opened fire. Shells screamed down, the frozen earth erupting beneath the blast. Machine guns roared from their prepared positions, their tracers slicing through the fog in deadly arcs. 34 tanks rolled forward, their searchlights cutting through the darkness to illuminate the fleeing soldiers. Survivors would later describe running through a wall of fire. They stumbled over bodies in the darkness. Men fell and did not rise again. The screams were constant. Behind them, the ruins of Buda were strewn with the dead. The slaughter was systematic. The breakout columns, weakened by months of starvation and stripped of heavy weapons, were torn apart. Some tried to surrender. Others scattered into the hills, where most were hunted down. Over the following days, a few incredibly kept running through the night, driven by nothing but pure survival instinct. Of the approximately 20,000 who attempted to escape, only 700 reached the German lines, a survival rate of just 3.5%, worse than most disasters of the Second World War. The cost of the siege was staggering, between 50,000 and 100,000 Soviet casualties, with estimates varying between Soviet and Western sources. Some Soviet reports place the figure at the higher end of that range, far higher than previously acknowledged in standard narratives. Between 38,000 and 49,000 Axis soldiers were killed. Another 38,000 to 40,000 civilians were killed, caught in the crossfire, dead from starvation, or executed by Aerocross gunmen along the banks of the Danube. This was not just one of World War II's costliest urban battles. It was mutual destruction on a scale that shocked even the perpetrators. By dawn on February 13th, the breakout was over. The frozen streets were carpeted with bodies. Budapest had fallen. But the true cost of Hitler's obsession was still being counted, not only in the ruins of the Hungarian capital, but on the very approaches to Berlin. In the end, what did Hitler gain from his Danube fortress? The oil fields he had sought to protect. Nagykanizsa, the strategic justification for the entire bloody gamble, fell to the Soviets within weeks of Budapest's collapse. The city he had declared would be held at all costs lasted exactly 50 days. And the elite panzer divisions he sacrificed in Operation Conrad, the 4th SS Panzer Corps, with its King Tigers and veteran crews, the very units that might have contested the Soviet advance on Berlin, were destroyed for nothing. Because in the end, this was what Budapest truly cost Germany: Berlin itself. By diverting the 4th SS Panzer Corps to Hungary in January, Hitler fatally weakened the Vistula front just as the Red Army was preparing its knockout blow. The January offensive against the now depleted German lines advanced with terrifying speed. Soviet forces raced west, reaching the Oder River the very approaches to Berlin. It was a direct causal link. The divisions wasted trying to save Budapest were the very ones Germany needed to defend its own capital. General Oberst Otto Wöhler and other senior officers had argued for a tactical withdrawal from Budapest, warning of exactly this outcome. But Hitler overruled them with his Führer directives: no retreat, hold at all costs. The parallels to Stalingrad are haunting, but this was worse. Unlike Stalingrad, where Paulus's army was genuinely trapped with no viable escape, the Budapest garrison had multiple opportunities for an early breakout. Each time, they were denied permission. The relief efforts were better coordinated than those at Stalingrad, but equally futile given the strategic reality Hitler refused to accept. Stalingrad was a turning point. Budapest was a death spiral. Both sieges mirrored the same pattern: the destruction of an irreplaceable German army for a dictator's stubborn, irrational pride. But the fall of Budapest directly enabled the final Soviet offensive. The sacrifice of the 4th SS Panzer Corps did not just fail to save one city. It lost Germany its capital. Today, the lessons echo in modern urban warfare. Grozny, Aleppo, Mariupol. The same patterns emerge: civilian suffering on a massive scale, the limits of armor in dense terrain, the catastrophic costs of siege warfare. Budapest demonstrated what military historians still study: that technological superiority means nothing without logistics, depth, and adaptability. The Siege of Budapest remains one of the most overlooked catastrophes of World War II. Hitler declared it a fortress to be held at all costs. He was right about the cost, but the bill came due in Berlin. Every story in history teaches us valuable lessons about strategy, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. Thanks for exploring today's story with us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to discover more fascinating historical stories with us. See you in the next episode, where strategy and intelligence continue to shape history.